So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to OpenUK's Future Leaders training session 4. This is on the open source initiative and open source definition. Just want to welcome everyone to the call today and say thank you for joining. And just to say that these training sessions are happening once a week at the moment on Fridays between 12 and 1 o'clock. And people can sign up by getting in contact with admin at openuk.uk. And I'll hand over to Amanda to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thanks, Robert. It's a great privilege, actually, to have Patrick Masson get up so early in the US for us. Patrick, you're in New York State right now?
I am, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for getting out, and thank you for coming and joining us today. I think you all know who Patrick is, but he is the Executive Director, the General Manager and Director at the Open Source Initiative. I'm not going to explain what the OSI is because that's going to be a lot of the subject of his talk. But Patrick has been running that organization for over 6 years and has over 20 years of experience around technology and open leadership and collaboration, which I think will probably come to the fore along with his teaching and university experience in his lecture today. With that, Patrick, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Let me apologize for my morning voice, still a little crackly here. But first, before I start, thank you very much for the invitation to meet with you today and share a bit about the open source initiative and the open source definition. Also, thank you to the Future Leaders crew who put up with my many emails and questions about setting things up. So I thought I would start off with a clip from Revolution OS. If you haven't had a chance to watch this video, I'd highly recommend it. It's on, it's available on YouTube, and it's a great documentary on the rise of free and open source software. And I think it sort of sets the tone for many of the things I'm going to talk about today.
California. We moved here in early 1995. This is 4,000 square feet. It was an incredible leap of faith for us to move out and take the company to our own office. Now, what's really important about this place is that this is the office where the term open source was invented. We wanted to get across the idea that the software was open, that the source code was available. Very important pieces. We had this meeting at the PA office. Where Eric, myself, and Christine Peterson from OSI Institute joined us, as well as several other people. When we came up with the concept of open source, we called Linus, in fact, and asked Linus if he liked it. He was interested, he liked it. Eventually, we came up with something that replaced free software. That was the beginning of open source. How do you think the word open source? You know, I think Christine Peterson was the person who really came up with the idea. We wanted, again, the idea that the source code was out there and it was open. There weren't many choices.
So hopefully you heard the video okay and saw it. So that industrial park today is now a parking lot. There's a big fancy building there. So they literally, where open source, the term was coined, is now Google offices. And I think the idea of the sort of scrappy hackers getting together to develop sort of the open source movement and the ethos behind it, and it being recognized and then taken in to become a core infrastructure of industry is something that you'll see throughout the evolution of the success of open source software. And I think it's pretty telling that the building that it started in is now a building where it's practiced. So the foundations of open source actually date back quite a bit. I won't go back to the earliest days when computing meant hardware and not software, and companies really provided software as a free way to maximize sales of their equipment, and they actually encouraged customers to co-develop and share their software in order to see the value of the hardware that they were selling. You know, I'll skip Bill Gates's open letter to hobbyists, if you want to look that up online, where he complains about, quote, the rampant software piracy among those sharing software on their home-built computers. And I'll also skip the 1974 U.S. Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works that was set up to investigate software and whether or not it should, and then recommended that it should include software in U.S. copyright law. But I'll start with something that most people probably know or have heard about, and that's the printer at MIT. So back in 2001, Richard Stallman, and I'll talk a little more about Stallman in a minute here, shared the impetus that led to the founding of the GNU Project, the Free Software Foundation, and the copyleft movement. Xerox, as I mentioned, had provided the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab with a new printer. And apparently that printer, this isn't a slam on Xerox, but apparently that printer tended to jam. And in order to address the problem, Stallman and his workmates there sort of applied their traditional approach by wanting to jump into the software and see if they could fix it. And they came up with a plan to really just have the printer notify people when it jams, so somebody could walk down and clear the printer and printing could continue. But unfortunately, the software on that printer wasn't available. It only came in the binaries. There's no source code, so they couldn't edit that, modify that, and make it work the way they needed it to. And this might be when Stallman first discovered the idea, if you don't control your computer controls you, and the free software movement was born. And as part of that movement, Stallman created what's called the 4 essential freedoms. The definition includes the freedom to run the program. And so you can run it for anything you want, the freedom to study and change the program. So if you have the program, you should have the source code so you can understand how it works. And if you have ideas to change it, you should be able to do that, improve it, make it work the way you want it to. Then you should be able to redistribute that program. So if I gave it to you, you can give it to a friend. And then finally, you should be able to redistribute the changes that you've made to help other people who have the same needs as you do. At the last copyleft conference in Brussels, Stephen Wally, he's at Microsoft now, but former HP, Docker employee, longtime open source advocate, shared an interesting story from his presentation at Copyleft Conf, and that the 4 freedoms were originally labeled 1 through 4, but Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Media suggested freedom 0 is the freedom to choose any license you want. And those who know anything about the FSF and Richard Stallman will probably understand why Stallman immediately updated the 4 freedoms to 0 through 3 instead of 1 through 4. So that's Stephen's story. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he told us during his presentation. So Stallman sought to develop software that everyone could modify and redistribute, that no distributor would be allowed to restrict further redistribution, and proprietary modifications would not be allowed. He wanted us to make sure that the software and the users remain free. So very much interested in user freedom. And remember that user freedom, because later on we'll be talking about something called software freedom. And I think there's a distinction there that we'll touch on. But this approach of copy left was sort of a play on the term copyright. And out of that movement, we have today things like the GPL, the General Public License. We have the Free Software Foundation and the GNU Project. So the GNU Project includes a variety of software projects, all distributed under the GPL. And as part of another sort of nerd fact is the GPL is not GNU Public License, it's General Public License. And GNU is actually, GNU's not Unix, it's a recursive acronym. So GNU's design is Unix-like, but it differs from Unix by being free software and containing no Unix code. So There's your sort of nerd fact for today. I'm sure there'll be more here. But today's software, there's a lot of the software you might recognize or use is distributed under GPL license, the family of GPL licenses. So Git, which GitHub is built on, Drupal and WordPress, which are major content management systems, MediaWiki, Wikipedia built on, Linux, obviously, is probably one that everyone recognizes there. I'm delivering this presentation on LibreOffice Impress. So most of these, I think, folks would recognize. So as you noticed, Linux was one of the examples on the previous slide. As a student, Linus Torvalds, the founder of Linux, started up what he called a little hobby, and that probably won't amount to anything big. His email as a student there is on the left. But Linux and rather Torvalds really benefited from the GPL licensing that made massive collaboration and innovation possible, where hundreds of developers, only hundreds at that time, now it's obviously thousands, could study, use, modify, redistribute the GNU tools to build Linux, not only the Linux kernel, but the Linux operating system. Torvalds took GNU software, for example, the GCC compiler, and other free software tools to create the new operating system that we know today as Linux. Although, another nerd comment here, if you're ever talking to a free software advocate, be sure to call it GNU Linux, because they'll want to make sure that GNU gets the credit for all of the tools that are included in the Linux operating system, and Linux is only the kernel. Eric Raymond was a software developer, but a contributor to the Linux project as well, and was fascinated by the development environment and practices Torvalds cultivated, and how the free software licensing scheme enabled it. Again, the promise or the permission first to use, modify, redistribute, study the software. His observations resulted in a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Again, if you might have heard of this, I highly suggest reading it. It's a little dated, but I think the lessons learned and the observations are key to getting an understanding of where the open source software came from, and traits you'll see in it today. Again, it's available online, no cost. But the book, when it came out, had a significant impact, and is, like I said today, considered the seminal work describing the open source movement and development. There's several practices in there that are or observations, I think they're called, that highlight how open source communities work. And it was Raymond was credited with this book as launching the open source software movement. The largest impact came from Netscape when it released source code for the Communicator web browser. So before Mozilla and Firefox, it was Mozilla was always around, but Netscape had Communicator. And technically, you could say that Netscape Communicator was the first open source project because it was released with the Netscape public license, which was the first license approved using the, what we'll talk about in a minute, the open source definition. So the NPL, which is now the Mozilla public license, was the first license to be labeled open source, and thus the first software, open source software, was the Communicator browser. As Larry mentioned in the video, the label open source was actually suggested by Christine Peterson. There were several people, Larry Augustine, Christine Peterson, Eric Raymond, John Mad Dog Hall, and several others got together in Palo Alto when they were meeting with Netscape to talk about how to release the source code. And they recognized this as an opportunity where they could take what Netscape was doing and offer it as a reference model to show the possibility, the idea that you could actually release your source code and that would be beneficial to both the code and the community. Soon after that meeting, the Open Source Initiative was formed with Raymond serving as the president. Other notable members from the original board included Bruce Perrins, who's the author of the Debian Free Software Guidelines, Ian Murdoch, the founder of Debian, and Debian is actually Deb and Ian. His girlfriend at the time was Deb and Ian, so that's why it's called Debian. There's another nerd fact for you. And Brian Behlendorf, who was the creator of the Apache web server, all served on the board, the original OSI board. And the mission of the OSI was, and still is today, to increase awareness and adoption of open source software and build bridges between open source communities. So why a new organization and label? So free software had been going along great. They just had this great success with Netscape about wanting to release their code. Why was there a new organization and a new label? So there was the confusion over free as in no cost versus freedom. When somebody, especially a software executive, heard, oh, free, they thought, oh, this must be cheap, developed by amateurs, must not be very good, must be kind of shoddy, and it's really just about cost. And they failed to recognize the 4 essential freedoms of use, study, modification, and distribution. Then there was the difference between user freedom and software freedom. So again, the Free Software Foundation is very interested in user freedom. If your computer controls you, then you're not free as a person, not just as a computer user. And software freedom is about the software should be free to be used for anything you want, modified any way you want. So there's a slight difference there in sort of the vision or ethics driving the 2 initiatives. And then there was again, just like Netscape, the organization wanted to make a pragmatic business case to illustrate the benefits of open source. So higher quality, more eyes on the software leads to finding bugs quicker, faster pace of innovation and development, better security, those sorts of things. And so if you can make the case for open source software through the terms that businesses were interested in, quality and improvement, then over ethical discussions around individual freedoms, that might be a better way to promote the movement. And then there was at the time, the Debian Free Software Guidelines were really implemented by the Debian community in order to understand what software should be included in a Linux distribution. And there wasn't a real way to identify software through the licensing. There was no license review process that would identify licenses that guaranteed software freedom, that had within them the availability to and the guarantee of the right to use, modify, and redistribute the software. So those were sort of the drivers that created the open source initiative. As I mentioned, Bruce Perrins was on the board, and he developed the Debian Free Software Guidelines. Those 9 at the time criteria used by Debian to assess software for the Debian Linux distribution were modified and became the first open source definition used by the OSI to certify licenses, what's called OSI approved open source licenses. And then in 2004, a 10th criteria was added, and we'll talk about these criteria in a minute. So here are the 10 criteria for the open source definition. I will actually go ahead and let Bruce describe what these are.
Eric and I decided to relabel what we've written for Debian as the open source definition, and to say open source is software that gives you a list of 9 rights, which is in the open source definition. The first right is free redistribution. This doesn't mean free as in no price, it means liberty. You have to be free to redistribute your software to someone else, and actually no price is a side effect. You can charge for that redistribution or not. It has to come with source code so that someone can maintain a program. If they go from a PC to a Mac, for example, they can change the software. Derived works have to be possible. If someone has to improve your program, distribute the result. There's a provision about integrity of the author source code, which says that the author can sort of maintain their honor, and if you make a change, you might have to change the name of the program or mark out your change very clearly so that your change doesn't reflect on the author. There's no discrimination against people or groups. The example I usually use is you can't stop an abortion clinic or an anti-abortion activist from using the software. There's no discrimination against fields of endeavor, and that means the software has to be usable in a business as well as in a school. The license has to be distributable. In other words, I have to be able to give that license to someone, and that license then should work if that someone gives it to yet a third person. The license can't be specific to a product. In other words, if I distribute my software on a Red Hat system, the license can say you can't distribute this on a SUSE or a Debian system. The license can't contaminate other software. So if I distribute this on a CD with another program, it can't say that other program must be free, otherwise you can't distribute my software. And then the only other part of the open source definition is a list of licenses that were accepted. And the ones that we started with were the GPL, which was actually the example for a lot of what's in the open source definition, the BSD license, because software for BSD system pre-existed Linux.
So that was our core, the OSI's core mission at the time, really to, or strategy, was to develop the open source definition, and then with that definition, certify or approve licenses that guaranteed software freedom. And today, that's, if you ask people that know about the OSI, that's probably what they'll first point to, is our role as steward of the open source definition and the internationally recognized authority in approving open source licenses. So today, the OSI has approved 80 plus licenses, and we highlight a list of 10 that really meet the needs of most people. And there's, I think Simon Phipps says, I'll give credit for saying this, if you think you need a new open source license, you really don't understand open source licensing. It's very rare for something new to come along that would actually trigger, although we just had a big one, the cryptographic, the CAL, cryptographic, oh, I forget what the A stands for now, but license that really deals with sort of issues around data that's shared across a network, and how that data is managed as part of an open source license or as part of an open source application. So the licensing process is managed through the aptly named license review process. That occurs, that's run by the OSI License Committee, and anyone may, even though I said, you know, please don't, submit a license for review. That's submitted to actually a public forum that current count is 329 members. And that public review will yield criticism of the license. And normally it's around something like, oh, that's redundant. There's already a license that does that, and you just didn't know that the, I don't know, that the Eclipse public license does that already. Or there's clearly issues around the restriction of one of the 10 criteria. So that sort of percolates in the forum for a while until a consensus of community emerges that helps the license review committee make a recommendation to the full OSI board. The board then takes a vote to approve or reject, or it could send it back to ask for some modifications of the license if it's warranted. The OSI is also involved in open source and standards, so that's helping standards setting organizations understand the impact of open source, that open source is a defined term. We have a lot of issues going on right now around standards bodies wanting to, and not just standards bodies, unfortunately, but we see more and more people using the label open source to either mean something different or maybe even morph it into something that serves the organization or the agenda of that organization. But importantly, all OSI approved licenses give permission first to use, modify, and redistribute the software. So before we have to engage in a big procurement or licensing discussion and contracting, because it carries an OSI approved license, you're guaranteed the right to use that software for anything you want, in any way you want, and modify it in any way you want, and then redistribute those modifications that you want. And that's permission first. We don't have to negotiate for those permissions. It's part of the license. That's why the license review process is so important. And then we also work to develop a variety of tools and communities that help further the understanding and use and healthy application of open source licenses and software. One example is Clearly Defined, which is a tool for license discovery and compatibility. That says comparability there, but I guess you're comparing them as well. And that helps organizations understand what the licenses are with the variety of code that they may be using independently or more often integrated within their infrastructure and within their companies. And that's getting a lot of support from large companies that are relying, Google again, that now has the parking lot that the actual OSI or open source was coined. Bloomberg, Microsoft, others are helping to build that tool because they see the value in understanding the licenses that they're using. We also work to promote and protect open source, so that's the ethos and ideals of the movement, but also the practical application. We send out dozens every year of what I guess I'd call infringement notices, where people are using the OSI mark to convey some sort of either perhaps implying an endorsement or that their tools they're open source. If you look over there, the Wonder Bar, which is a Internet of Things sort of Raspberry Pi, Arduino-like thing, has the OSI logo in the corner. Unfortunately, none of the software released with the Wonder Bar was carrying an OSI license, approved license. So they not only put our logo on there, implying that it was open source software. So there's a trademark infringement there, and there's also a question about misleading or misuse of the logo to imply open source software is included. So that's open washing and open source. So open washing is a company that, or even a project that touts its openness, but in reality operates in sort of a closed way. They tout the benefits of transparency, collaboration, and so on, but they're really just after people's contributions, whether that's money or code contributions, because the actual software project's not released under an OSI approved license that doesn't guarantee use, modification, and redistribution. And open source software is sometimes literally just calling the software open source software when it's clearly not. Yola Sailfish OS is a great example. They touted a new operating system for their Yola tablet that was going to be open source. They did a bunch of marketing around it. They had an Indiegogo campaign that raised $3.5 million. But at the end of the day, they had no open source software, and the end user license agreement actually denied use of the software, sharing of the software without their express permission. The Commons clause, the Redis put out, attached originally a while back to their license, to the Apache license, is another example of sort of open source software. So the idea is, oh, it's distributed under Apache, but we're just going to add this Commons clause that limits use to non-business, and that's a violation of the open source definition. So by attaching that to the Apache software, it made the Redis core, I should say, is still open source, but all the Redis tools that were attached that you used with the Redis core technology, that was no longer open source. And then public policy, we work with a variety of governments and government agencies and departments to help them understand open source software. So in the US, for example, there was the source code policy that required 20% of all code to be open source. We worked with the UK Cabinet Office, states. We have a long list of international organizations and government agencies that we've worked with on the website. We also do education, K-12, higher ed, and even professional development. We're offering, we're working with Brandeis University on formal training. There's desktop programs, putting Linux laptops and desktops in the hands of students who might be living in underserved schools to give them access to technology. We have a membership and community outreach, so 1,500 all-time members, 3,000 contributors, 80 affiliate members. Affiliate members are nonprofit organizations, so you can see a few of them there. And then we'll attend conferences around the world to help share information about open source software. We get corporate and industry support. And all of this isn't so much to say, okay, look how awesome we are, we're big or whatever, because we're really not. But you know, the reason we look for support from the community is so that we can work with the community as an advocate, that we have the authority derived from the community. It's very powerful when you're confronting an organization that might be involved in open source or open washing to say, well, you know, this open source foundation or project that you're using recognizes the OSI. These technologies that you're using, these companies, you know, if you've got your site on your code on GitHub, it's very nice to be able to bring with us the names and voices of these organizations to help us make the case that open source software is software distributed with an OSI approved license. So please don't call it anything else. You're confusing the rest of the industry and you're introducing ambiguity and confusion. And at a time when more and more software is being released under open source licenses, having that confusion will only cause everyone problems. So please get in line with the rest of the community, and thank you very much. So I thought I'd quickly go over sort of a 30-year perspective of what the OSI is doing, and previously over the first and second decade and where we see issues on the horizon. So the first decade was really about validating open source as a legitimate development model. The licenses could be written to give permission first, and that the software being developed was high quality software. The second decade was really around the adoption ascendancy of open source software being recognized by business and government and large organizations. And then looking ahead, we're anticipating there'll be questions of assimilation, how organizations are authentically engaging with open source development communities, and even one another, where even those who are typically seen as competitors will work together around shared interests in technology. So in the first decade, individuals were seen, that the developers were seen as sort of individual hackers and really working on one project that they did maybe in their spare time. And it was really that person, you know, scratching the personal itch of, oh, I need this to do this, I'll just fix it myself. And it's really just for this desktop application or this you know, something for my web server or my application server somewhere. I'm just, you know, sort of that individual. The next decade we saw professionals actually being employed by either companies that were investing in open source software or companies themselves being formed around software to deliver open source software. Moving on, as the infrastructure sort of gets finished, the individuals will probably be involved as, you know, sort of professional generalists, integrating technologies and contributing to a variety of projects in order to deliver services rather than delivering software. The projects were predominantly replacements of off-the-shelf stuff that you would find. So in the first decade, it was here's a new desktop productivity suite, or a new graphics tool, or a web server, or things like that. It was just like, instead of Internet Explorer, we have Mozilla Firefox. Instead of Office, Microsoft Office, we have OpenOffice at the time, now LibreOffice, although OpenOffice is still there. Remotely managed web infrastructure in the second decade, obviously. You think of cloud providers, or even before that was called the cloud, we had internet service providers where you had co-located or remotely managed web servers. This is the hardware that you installed your stuff on. And then moving out the next decade is really a family of component parts where you sort of spin up stacks and you aggregate them on the fly based on needed. And you're touching a lot more projects and a lot more communities at one time in order to get that to work. You're not sort of running it yourself, you're engaging with broader communities. Then the communities themselves are initially started off as informal groups of individuals. So you sort of had user groups, or you had some group that formed around a particular technology or application, and they all had a shared interest in this one sort of tool or this one technology. And they self-organized and self-directed themselves into developing that project. And then the next decade, you saw nonprofits emerge, so Apache Foundation, Drupal Foundation, Python Software Foundation, Linux Foundation. And these were for nonprofit organizations that were put together to give long-term stability to the project. You weren't relying on individual contributors. You had greater resources, sponsorships. You had code repositories and archives that ensured that the tools were there for longer than however Mary kept it on her hard drive. Moving forward, it'll be consortia, foundations, and trade associations. Even the OSI is thinking, I wonder right now if we could provide value to the open source community by perhaps engaging in non-technology contracts that could be used by open source projects out there. So, we need community or communications people, or we need marketing people. Can a consortia, a foundation of foundations be developed that provides sort of infrastructure and resources to allow projects to run more effectively? The value of open source initially was seen as, well, freedom and control and customization. I think we saw that with Stallman and wanted to update the printer software. Then as business and larger organizations, government, for example, got involved, there was a real interest in the total cost of ownership. The idea was, we can start up an organization with lower costs associated with infrastructure and technology. We could run the organization at lower costs. So it was really focused on the traditional business decision-making around cost, and that was the key driver for the value seen in open source. Moving on, it's just really become the de facto standard. It's where the innovation's happening. It's now the best-in-class software. It's no longer like in the first decade, it was this competitor that had to prove itself as a viable alternative to the proprietary option. It's now best-in-class. And if you think about it, all the innovative tools that are coming out are by default open source. They're starting off as open source. The barriers at the time in the first decade were feature parity, support, security. So who are you going to call if it breaks down? I'm not going to call, Fred at 2 o'clock in the morning. How do I get my service level agreement, my support contract? What happens if the developer dies? There was all those sort of, those were the issues that were affecting open source. In the second decade, it was about management, staffing, hiring qualified developers that understood the open source software and the open source development environment and community norms, integrating that between proprietary, maybe already existing infrastructure. And moving forward, it's really, again, about the authenticity, trying to combat those who are leveraging the success of open source and using it as a marketing tool. People coming up with novel schemes to sort of circumvent the community expectations around open source, and compliance with open source. So again, as more and more tools carry an open source license, there's license compatibility issues that organizations need to be aware of. Business adoption and interest for not the use of, but developing software. So the issues were, how can I contribute freely? So I'm spending this time developing my new great little tool, but I'm doing that on my own time. How do I get paid? And the idea of sustainability is obviously still around today. We hear a lot of discussions about maintainer fatigue and project sustainability. So that's still an ongoing issue. But often those get promoted by companies and startups that are working into looking to monetize their work. In the second decade, it was participate and keep control. So I want to release this software, but how can our organization or myself ensure that the development is in line with our business needs? If we put it out there and it spins off and starts doing something completely different than what we needed it to do, is it still valuable to us to participate in this project? And then this might be somewhat controversial, but I recently sort of made the comment, open source will really take off once software companies go away. Because the value of open source software is the shared development that occurs, the many eyeballs that make all bug shallow, which is Linus's law. The value of that is most seen when companies get together and work on non-differential technology. So who cares? Did anyone ever walk into a supermarket or any store and go in and say, well, what kind of HR system are you running? What type of inventory system? No, they don't do that. They just go in and say, hey, where do I find the cereal, or where do I get a lamp? So those tools that can be that are needed by every business or every organization where collaboration can occur, those are the real people that are going to be able to identify the features and the requirements that are needed. Those are the organizations that are best going to understand how to implement those tools, not taking a tool developed by a third party and then having to change their internal business processes to meet the functionality and the workflow of the tool. So if we can get companies that rely on again, infrastructure that's not a business differentiator, then that's where the real innovation will happen. We've worked with, for example, Boeing, GE, Siemens, Rolls-Royce all have to submit their designs for jet engines to various government agencies to get approval. And they are all developing their own visualization software. So nobody buys a plane, or I don't know anything about aeronautical engineering, but the value is in the engine, not the software that you do the testing with. And in fact, having a single platform is beneficial because then the output of that is all the same. So the data and the processing that occurred to get that data can be mapped against the different companies to ensure that they're all being tested the same way. So all those companies should work together to develop one testing and visualization system rather than developing their own and incurring those costs independently. So a software company isn't the best solution for that. Having a group of companies working together is. Not just companies, any organization. So the open source initiative, again, our efforts were first focused on licensing awareness and adoption of open source software, making the case that this is legitimate. During the second decade, it was building communities. So getting organizations and projects to stop replicating themselves. So more joiners and fewer starters. We don't need 10 different office suites. We don't need 20 different tools that are doing the same thing. When I was in higher ed, I did a survey and found that there are almost 300 different learning management systems, which today people will know as probably through their experience working remotely for their children because of the COVID issue, taking courses online. So we don't need 300 of those. Let's get all those people and all that brain power together to work on maybe a few projects that might be different only because of the technology or maybe the way they deliver the technology. And then moving forward, again, authentic engagement. So I think I have 10 minutes left. I just wanted to lastly go through some of the ways that the OSI is looking to promote authentic engagement, what we're looking for when people or companies say that they're very invested in open source. Well, these are some tests that you can look at to understand whether or not the company or the organization that you want to work with is authentically engaging in open source. And it's also a way, your own maturity model, that you can look at how the company or you are engaging with the open source community to see how, quote, authentic or you're working with open source software. So, the first one is, do you use the software? So I always laugh when, I guess I shouldn't be so snarky, but people that get up and tout their open source project, but they're delivering their presentation about how awesome their open source software is on a Mac or a PC. So why aren't you fully engaged in open source software? Why? I mean, this isn't a judgment, but what's the limitation to using Linux desktop? So I'm delivering on a Linux desktop right now using only open source software. This project only used open source, or this presentation only used open source tools to be developed. So are you eating your own dog food? Are you part of the culture? Is it part of the company's culture to include open source, evaluate it as part of procurement, contribute to it as through employee work? Is it something that's just expected within your company? Are you promoting the project? So rather than just using it as your company or you or your project or whatever organization you're with, are you promoting the use of not only your project or the things you rely on in order to get contributions to your work, but are you promoting open source in general? Are you contributing to the project? And not just contributing in terms of code. I mean, this is the thing that everyone thinks of. There's code contributions. But are you contributing by participating, holding meetups, doing trainings like this, thing non-technical, non-code contributions? Are you participating in that way? For example, you could commission improvements. So you might not have internal resources to be able to develop the tools or host the event or whatever it might be, but are you investing in the project so that the project advances for the whole community, not just yourself? Hiring committers. Who are the people that are most involved with the project, and are they being tapped on the shoulder as employees? Are you recruiting from this group? That's beneficial also to the company or the organization as well, because obviously you're getting the most people with the most familiarity with the project. Of course, cash donations as a nonprofit. I'm all for cash donations to nonprofit organizations and open source projects. And then finally, are you assuming good faith? Do you behave in a way as an organization that assumes everyone that you're working for, including yourself, is really here to make the best improvements for the community and furthering the project rather than only furthering yourself? And that is it, with 10 minutes left for questions. I hope I am on schedule.
Patrick, that was fabulous. Does anybody have any questions for Patrick?
Here, I'll stop my view so you can see my ugly mug.
There we go.
There I am. I have to get my branded apparel in there too, sorry.
It's sit up tall. Okay, well, while everybody else is just getting the courage up to ask you a question, I have one for you. I was really pleased, I have to say, to see Christine Peterson acknowledged for coming up with the term open source. That's quite a recent thing to see in my experience, and very pleasing that a woman came up with it. I think I've mentioned to you before, Patrick, we had an Easter miracle last Sunday in the UK. I'm not a particularly religious woman, but I couldn't believe when Matt Hancock on his government briefing said that the COVID contact tracing app that the UK government is going to release shortly with the help of NHSX will be public sourced, or what he at least said was the source code will be made public. So as you can imagine, my phone immediately started to buzz and I started to tweet asking the question, will that be open source? Let's be clear, because there's obviously a difference, as everybody who's seen your presentation, if they didn't understand before, understands now, that it must have a license attached to be open. I also had a conversation this morning with Sander van Willebrand in the Netherlands, who is dealing with exactly the same issue in the Netherlands with the Dutch government, where they have also said they're going to share the source, but haven't said they're going to open source it. So as we're talking to our governments around Europe, I don't know if you're having similar experiences in the US, don't know if you want to talk about your US COVID experience, to be honest, but I wonder whether, bearing in mind this moment in time, you have any thoughts or advice for us in trying to persuade our governments that the right thing to do is not to make the source code available, but actually to open source.
Yes, so just my COVID experience. My wife is actually a critical care pulmonologist and ICU director, so I haven't seen her in weeks. So I do have a very personal take on this. I'm sure many others do as well. But yes, I think in the US, and we've seen in a variety of different countries, first, the willingness to share innovation and development, I think, is great. You know, the cynic could say, well, it's government work, so it should be public, which I, first of all, totally agree with. In the US, we have public domain requirements around the development of government-funded, developed resources. So whether that's a photograph or plans for a new regulator, respirator. And often people confuse public domain or the release of public into the public, any resource, as the same as open source. But that's actually not sufficient, because it's open, or sorry, because it's public domain, I could take that software, modify it, and then put a proprietary license on it, or not even modify it, just take it and put a proprietary license on it. And this has come up quite a bit, especially when we're working with the US government and also the UK Cabinet Office. And the example I would give is, well, imagine that internal development of a fuel management system was done by the forestry service or the ag department, when they wanted to, for all sorts of good reasons, understand how they were consuming fuel within their trucks and tractors and so on. And so they put that out there as public domain. Masson Industries, Pat Masson Industries, could come along and take that and put a new brand on it, new logo on it, and put a proprietary license on it, and then end up selling it back to the same government. But this time, let's say, because it's a large government, it's actually the military or some other department that we're selling that same software that was developed by. So by putting an open source license on it, you're actually guaranteeing that source code is always available. Now, depending on the license, it might be that modifications aren't, or other code that's distributed with it isn't open source, but that core work developed by the government will always be guaranteed to give permission first. That source code will always be available. So that's an important understanding for government to comprehend. That's an important factor for them to understand, that by putting an open source license on it, they're actually guaranteeing that software will remain available to the public. And it's also fostering further development. As I mentioned about the learning management systems, where there are almost 300 different ones. I mean, I've seen multiple examples of open source projects that are trying to do the same thing. There should be more collaboration. And then finally, specific to open source as a label, open source should be describing, I know it's used for open source hardware and things like that, but those designs should carry a Creative Commons license, not a open source license, open source software license. And I won't get into the way the open source label is being used to describe all sorts of things. And I will acknowledge that the open source label predated the OSI when it was used to describe intelligence gathering and open sources for collecting intelligence. But within the software and technology industry, it's globally recognized that open source means open source software that carries an OSI approved license.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if he's on the call, but if Andrew Katz was on the call, he would be spinning at you saying a Creative Commons license and sending you off to look at the CERN Open Hardware license, which he's been involved in.
Sure.
I don't know if he's on the call. I don't know if he's there.
Sure.
Talking of Andrew,
Yes.
you may also see, you mentioned the Commons Clause, and the problem with the Commons Clause is, of course, as I think Andrew covered last week, the limitation on field of use. So restricting usage of what would otherwise be open source software properly licensed to not being able to be used on a sale or a commercial basis, including services. Andrew wrote a really good blog about the ethical license, which explains that point. It's on the OpenUK website. And that restriction on field of use, even if it's for something that you might consider positive, like, you know, doing something ethical, is important. Andrew, are you on the call? I've just seen a number pop up.
I am, yes. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Didn't know you were there. There you go. I jumped to your defense.
Thank you.
I know we've got somebody who is very definitely a future leader, Joy Burson from the US, on the call, and Joy's put her hand up in a very structured and organized way to ask you a question.
Amanda, and good morning, Patrick. I'm right there with you in the East Coast US. So my question is about I have two questions actually. One is that, you know, several writers on open source licenses have said that you know, because the technology always seems to lead the law, a lot of law hasn't quite been settled, and there's a disparation between, you know, the settled law when it comes to some of these license and what actual best practices are. So my question is, does the OSI anticipate in the coming years having to review any existing licenses as there are court cases and that kind of thing throughout the world? And are there any examples where you're concerned about these licenses from a legal standpoint?
So I'm not an attorney, just to be clear. So the question, are we concerned about any of these licenses from a legal standpoint? So I can make a license for anything. And as long as we agree, two parties agree with it, then that's a valid license. The question arises when one of those two parties don't want to, or there's a dispute over what the terms of that or the language of that license actually means. So I think there are instances where there's community norms that are currently defining terms or labels or attributes of licenses. And those could be changed or be clarified based on a court decision. So those are definitely areas that we're watching. I think one of the benefits of having organizations like the OSI and the number of organizations that recognize the OSI and the OSI approved licenses is there's a body of work and a community of standards or practices that help to avoid such lawsuits, that a lot of this is sort of recognized. And this is why I think organizations and projects like the Future Leaders is important, is not to brainwash everyone to thinking the same way, but to help explain those norms so that engagement is understood beforehand and expectations are understood so that everyone aligns with those community norms and practices. The OSI has in the past evaluated software. If you look at the OSI approved licenses, you'll see deprecated or no longer recommended licenses. A few years ago, we did something called the License Proliferation Project, where we recognized that approving licenses was not the goal, but because approving licenses that essentially did the same thing wasn't helpful to the community because it created confusion. Well, which one do I use? Which one actually says that this is the license that allows me to do this? So I think there is a constant reflection on the current state of license. There are right now discussions about whether licenses that were long ago approved in recognition of new technologies around network infrastructure, for example, make those licenses either unclear or actually conflict now with the open source definition. So
you know, when we're talking about that history and not brainwashing people, I'm hoping that Chris Lamb is going to do, who's on the call, is going to do one of our sessions in a few weeks' time. I think we probably will have to wrap quite soon, but I know there's 2 more questions for you. Sammy, I think you were next.
It's actually a question. It was quite interesting listening to you about the statement around public domain. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Sorry, it just sort of indicated that I was cut off for a second. I do see this quite a lot. Sort of developers come to me and say, well, we found this on the internet, can we use it? It's publicly available. And my first question, ask them, have you opened that document? Does it say anything about copyright in the front page? And more often than not, actually, there is. So it's interesting, that misunderstanding around what is easily available versus actually the concept of this is public domain or is licensed under and again, it is very complex, because sometimes they come to me and say, oh, there is no copyright notice, there's nothing in this piece of code, and it's available on the internet. Can we do it? And of course, that doesn't give you the license and the rights that you need. So I think education is certainly a key factor, you know, making people understand that, yes, this is an open source license or is licensed under a proprietary license. It really is very essential, and we can only improve that through education. You know, this forum is a really good forum to start to get that understanding correct.
You know, Sammy, I'm going to jump in. I think there's one problem there, and the problem is, and not with what you've said, getting everyone to understand that there is an assumption, or there has to be an assumption, that there is copyright in the code and that you can't use it without a license. Just again and again repeating that to developers.
Yeah.
Why should they know about IP? You know, some of them know a lot more than I do about it, but many of them understandably don't know, or they know something really detailed about copyright but do not know that very basic assumption.
Yeah, again, my comment was even in the context of educating government officials or people who are, you know, execs or you know, there's really lack of understanding about the basics in that context. And you're absolutely right. The statement from Matt Hancock around this will be publicly available. What does that mean? Is that the government going to license it under a proprietary license and allowing people freedom to use it, or are they going to use an open source?
Well, I can say, sorry, Patrick, to hijack this, I can say that on OpenUK's behalf, I contacted NHSX, who are leading on this for the government, and yesterday completed a form volunteering OpenUK to advise on licensing and governance should the government require that in releasing the app. So fingers crossed that they know we're here and they know it needs done. So let's see where we get to. I think there's one final question. Magdalena, who's one of our future leaders.
Yes, thank you very much, Amanda. My question is very much similar to what Sammy and also you have mentioned during from the beginning of the call. And I have, I think, very broad and a question which basically leads to the assumption, if only education and marketing and also this kind of social pressure can help us really to encourage public entities and also other communities to use open source and also understand what it is, because there is a lot of confusion between open source and public domain and open access. So
I agree. Was there? I didn't know if there was a question. Sorry.
So maybe the question is isn't it for you a little bit discouraging that after so many years there is still like not enough understanding in this topic?
Well, that's depressing. I mean, Wired Magazine said open source won, so we should be able to close shop now and walk away with a victory. It's
opportunity.
It is frustrating. I think we're seeing the most, at least what seems to be the most. Maybe it's not actually. I don't have any data behind this, but we're frequently running into this issue where those new to, not necessarily the new generation, but those new to open source don't have an understanding of the scope of open source. So we're seeing comments like, well, open source is anything that I say it is. It's, as Sammy, I think, had mentioned, it's online, so I put it on GitHub. I think that's, so it must be open source. I found it on Stack Overflow, so it must be open source there. So there's a sort of post-open source phenomena that's happening where organizations and people are just accustomed to working in an open environment with open resources. So the assumption, of course, is I'm just going to take this and sort of implement it, and it must be okay because I found it on GitHub. And I think it was interesting what Sammy noted about public domain and in the public. Public domain is actually a declaration that says, I'm abandoning all my rights to this. I have no claim on this. There is no license associated with public domain. So you can do anything you want with it. And that's a declaration by the author that gives you permission to do that. In the public just means, it could be anything, like I just put a picture on my website. Doesn't mean you can use it. It's still all rights reserved. So unfortunately, as people have grown up with this, and I mean grown up in terms of the professional experience, that they've taken on and become more engaged in technology where open source is there, or even if they haven't, they've been enveloped by it as organizations have engaged with other entities. They've just been immersed in open source. They're bumping into this, and it might, believe it or not, after 20 years, actually be the first time that some government agency or some procurement director or CIO or somebody has actually had to make decisions around open source. And so they're still discovering it for the first time. And I think that's a different driver, is that it's being, like I said, that's enveloping them versus years ago. And when it first started, organizations had to go out and seek to become participants. So now all of a sudden I'm surrounded by this, so I have to deal with it. Whereas before I had to know about it and go find it. So I had to educate myself in order to engage. Now I'm being forced to educate myself because it's just the de facto norm that's affecting so many organizations.
Thanks, Patrick. I think probably we're 10 minutes over time. We should probably wrap up. I should remind everybody that Tea Break Tuesday at 11 on Tuesday, we're sticking with the COVID-19 theme and the open healthcare with Kumar Jacob MBE, who is the founder and CEO of Mindwave, founded Dream Reality Interactive, and is on the board of South London and Moseley NHS Trust. So that should be a really interesting discussion with a cuppa at 11 on Tuesday. I'm going to hand you over to Katie Gibson, who is co-chair of Future Leaders, to wrap up. Thanks again, Patrick.
Yeah, just to echo Amanda again, thank you so much, Patrick, particularly for getting up so early. The rest of us probably just rolled out of bed a few hours ago. But yes, next Friday, the 24th of April, Ian Mitchell QC will be talking about open source procurement. So get in touch with admin@openuk.uk if you'd like to attend that one. And thank you very much to everyone for joining.
Bye-bye. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Oh, bye.